Yes, thank you. We have another presentation this evening from Chief Jim Blocker to provide some information to the community as a follow-up to some of the conversations that have been ongoing and will continue to go on in our community. We just think this is important information for the community to have to help inform our decision making. So, Chief.
Hi, good evening, Commission, Mayor, staff, and our community. If you can go ahead and move that, advance that too, please. Let's talk about our operational pace. So this presentation was really requested to give what is the summer activity and the operational pace. What's the current situation at the police department? There's a lot of discussion about how we're handling what we're doing right now. There's a lot of discussion about how we're handling the most recent shootings, where our gangs involved, and then more importantly, how are we working progressively towards addressing some of the cases that remain cold. And there was some confusion about databases and the information. So I'm going to try to get through many of that in a brief, but try to be as informational as I can. So here's the patrol division. Summer. We always know the summer is exceptionally busy. Multiple calls for service. If you look on the chart to the right, that bar chart, you're going to see, ironically, even Tuesdays, the number of calls for services that are generated are exceptionally high throughout the summer. If I were to pull this same chart in the wintertime, it would almost be cut in half. The lower numbers are in blue. That's still self-initiated calls. In other words, that's officers out being as progressive as they can. They're going out, they're meeting their greeting, they're still fulfilling their responsibilities within their specific patrol areas. But at the same time, they also have to answer all of those calls, which are in green. That is the color above the blue. And you'll notice that they are in many cases taking as many as 150 to 200 to 250 calls a day. That's a lot of work. What is our metric? How do we know? Are we having an impact? How do we know the impact on resources? You'll hear me say it throughout this presentation, but throughout the year, the operational requirements on our capacity always exceed our capability every summer. It's not just our issue, it's every agency in America, especially up here in the Midwest and in the Northeast, where just for some reason summers is our busy time of the year. But if you take it on average, it all evens out in the end. What is our metric? We look at priority 1 calls for service. Those are those emergency calls for service that we need to get to now. National response time for those are about 12 and a half minutes. If we keep it under 9, we're still below the national average. In reality, the majority of our calls are between 6 and 7 minutes. If we keep it that way and we pull that data from our dispatch CAD data, that's computer-aided dispatch software, what that does is that logs when the call came in, when the call went out to the officer, and ultimately when the officer arrived. And so that's how we can see. And again, we're still below the national average. Next slide, please. The next 4 slides are about how are we taking information, analyzing it on a 24-hour basis, and then disseminating it. We do that through a series of products called Trends, Alerts, Repeat Calls for Service, and Hotspot Policing. And I'm going to walk you through those briefly. Trends. Trends are something that is ongoing and continuous, but more importantly has some sort of resolution. So in this particular slide, here we are saying not only are there multiple conflicts or there's malicious destruction of property going on, but we're also telling the officers there are warrant packets out there for suspects. Take a look at them. See if you can go find these folks. If we find them, we'll scoop them up, and maybe that will eliminate some of the trends. Next slide. Let's go on to alerts. Alerts. This is hot. Just today, we found out, many of you probably got the information blast already, we had an attempt child abduction just a little while ago, around 2:30, 2:40 this afternoon. We take that information, we disseminate it immediately, but then for the next 24 hours, officers will get the details of that information. That's an alert. And again, there are multiple trends, there are multiple alerts, and we have our Fusion Center that are producing this document on a daily basis. And in this particular example, you'll see highlighted in red, we're telling officers, not only do you need to pay attention to this particular car in this particular area, but there may be a gun involved. Images are put up. We know who the suspect will be, so they know who to look for, along with basic information about that person. Let's move on to the next slide. Repeat calls for service. This is important. The key words here in repeat calls for service, you see ongoing, continuing, silent observer tip, or down below. you'll see a high number of incidents reported. That is our alert. That is telling officers, hey, this is ongoing. It's continuous. We really need you to pay attention to this particular area. That is driven by the sergeants. It is driven by the shift commanders. All that analyst is doing is pulling information, putting it out, and then we are operating off of it. It's just a smarter approach. Next slide is about hotspot policing. Mostly, this particular slide focuses on property crimes. It was just about 3 weeks ago we had a rash of break-in and enterings, not just B&Es. These were occupied dwelling B&Es. These were exceptionally dangerous, and they were frightening for most of the community. Again, that's a great example where we put it together. We determined who it was. We established a wide net. We had to determine where they're coming from, where are they hitting, and more importantly, how do we stop them? And it took us about 7 days, but ultimately all the suspects had been arrested. One of the suspects, almost immediately when he arrested him, we put him in the interrogation room. We said, hey, what's going on? And he said, man, I'm just addicted to heroin. Right away. He just told us what the issue was. But again, that's how we utilize this information as it comes in. Now let's back up a little bit. Next slide. Let's talk about investigations, generally speaking. Long-term investigations, there is a difference between sort of the daily operational patrol division. Those are the men and women that are out there that are taking about 70,000 calls for service a year. They're the ones that take the call initially and deal with it. If it's going to be a longer-term investigation, it's immediately shifted or transferred to the Investigations Bureau. The type of calls for service the Investigations Bureau is going to pick up are home invasions, property crimes, drugs, gang. We have a gang surveillance unit, violent crimes. Interesting here to note, even gun crimes, we will track that. So far, year to date, as of Friday when this slide was generated, we had 94 guns that had been taken off the street. You'll notice it's 98 now. That was just over the weekend. Let's go to the next slide, please. Here is where, although, as I indicated, every summer the requirements exceed our operational capability almost daily, and we have to just manage it, and we're used to it. Because not only are they just operational requirements, there's vacations, there's special events, there's a lot going on in the summer that we have to respond to. But it's just part of how we do business. And so we staff up to respond to this. But there's one exception to that, where we bring everyone in that is necessary, and that's when a homicide. Those first 72 hours are critical. We bring in a vast number of people to immediately start to collect all the information that we can at that time, because we know once that case is advanced, time is our worst enemy. Information loss is our worst enemy. And I got to tell you, there's nothing more frustrating for a detective, and even more frustrating for the family and the victims involved, is when we can't take it all away. Now, budget allocation is for this particular bureau is about $4.7 million. That includes our lab, which will be fully accredited in 2019. Which, by the way, our department, we hope to have that also accredited by the Michigan Board of Accreditation for Law Enforcement Agencies, also in fiscal year 19. We have our Fusion Center, our Detective Bureau, our Gang Surveillance Unit, and then our Special Investigations Unit are part of this number that I just shared with you. Next slide, please. Let's talk about trend and overviews. One more slide, please. A discussion that came up and is relevant today is the number of shootings that we've had. It's really not anything unlike we're seeing across the country right now. And we certainly saw these kinds of numbers last year. We are currently at 34 shootings year to date here in the city of Battle Creek. Now, if you look through those shootings, if we break them down and you look at that bar graph, you'll see one was an accidental discharge, 2 were homicides, homicide other, 9 were shots fired in an occupied building, 4 were at a vehicle, 4 were at a person, 10 persons were actually shot but not murdered, so it's a separate category, and finally 2 shots were fired at an unoccupied vehicle. Next slide, please. Now let's break down some of these shootings. Here you have in the top sort of semicircle, let's just say that's the North Side Gang. On the bottom is the South Side Gang, and literally that's how we'll refer to them. In the middle are the shootings. Those lines that connect are either vehicles, dwellings, or persons that are involved based on the incident itself. This is how we track all of these incidents. This is how we monitor, and this is how we link. This is a link diagram. This is how we bring them all together. What's the takeaway from this particular slide? Is that person from the right to the left, just below the two green gun icons, that person was an unintended target. Also, just a little bit, few more lines over to the left, down, there's a home. That home was an unintended target. If I were to tell you what's the takeaway, what's the center of gravity for this problem, it's just that. You know, we know that these beefs are going to happen. I'm going to talk about them in just a minute. We know that these fights, these quarrels are going to happen, but there's the challenge. It's not just a police problem. It's a community problem. It's those unintended targets. We certainly don't want any shootings. But in reality, when it comes to this work, what we really, really don't want is that. It's the same discussion we had last year, and it's the same discussion we're bringing up this year. One of the drivers of this particular violent surge that we've had here this summer was there has been an ongoing, some old scores, and then a current video. It was a hip-hop / rap video that was released on social media. And it was actually one gang unit mocking the other. Well, that did not help the situation. It further agitated it. And that was really, I think, one of the starting drivers of some of this violence that we're starting to see here this summer. Next slide, please. I want to walk you through just a few real examples of the current situation and what actually happens on the ground. Now, every slide that I'm showing you are slides that we disseminate internally as we share information. Obviously, we had to pull a lot of the data because most of these are active investigations going on. But here, for example, this particular slide, you'll see in the top of this slide are a series of cell phone icons. That is 911 calls coming in to the 911 center, directing officers to respond. We had a shooting, hence the gun icon in the middle. When officers arrived, there were over 50 people, but none of them were cooperating. When they made contact with the victim, who had a hole in his body, also, he was not cooperating. He didn't even know what happened. He wasn't even so sure he had been shot. This is one of the challenges that we are facing. Next slide, please. Example number 2. Here's another good example, but this, I think, is even more poignant. In this particular situation, we had great witnesses. They told us what the vehicle looked like. They told us who the shooter was. Officers then moved into the area, apprehended the suspect. We've ultimately since charged the suspect. The victim does not want to cooperate. He's not even acknowledging that he was shot. Here's the challenge. If the victim would just cooperate, on a really good day, we'll get 3 to 5 years. On a great day, we might get 7 to 10 years. This particular charge, without the victim cooperating, we may get, in our criminal justice system, 6 months. As a witness, how interested are you in pushing the fact that you're the only one willing to talk about this case? I'm not highlighting these cases to say it's any one person's fault. What I'm highlighting here is these are the challenges we are facing as a community. And they're also the challenges that we have to address together. Let's move on to the next slide. Here's another particular incident that just recently happened. This happened at Kendall in Michigan at Nick's West Side. Although that's not on there, I'll just tell you where it was. Just outside of the security camera, same thing. Multiple witnesses. Victim was not even willing to be acknowledged that he had a hole in his body and he had been shot. Let me explain to you why some of those things happen. Next slide. Let's walk through these numbers. 9, if you look at this bar graph, 9 of these cases are active. 3 of these cases out of the 32 have been closed by arrest. That leaves this bigger graph in the middle. That's 17 cases. Over 50% of these cases, just over 50% of these cases, the big question mark is why. 2 of the cases have warrants obtained. In other words, charges have been filed and warrants have been obtained. They just haven't been arrested yet. And then finally 1, a warrant request packet. In other words, a request for a charge to be authorized has been sent to the prosecutor's office. That's 15 out of the 17 cases we have actually actioned and worked. Here's the issue and the challenges. 1, it's hard to take these cases forward when we don't have the evidence. Two, it's even harder when we have unverified and uncooperated evidence, whether it's a witness statement or otherwise. It's even more difficult when we don't have a victim that's willing to tell us what happened. And why is that? There is some fear of retaliation, as I described earlier in that one incident. They're the only ones willing to talk about it, so why step forward? Two, there is a legitimate concern about being a snitch. And I don't want to be the only one that have stepped out in the community and been that person. And then some, and this is a larger majority of them, certainly for the victims, they just prefer good old-fashioned street justice. This is my problem, this is my beef, this is my challenge. I'm just going to deal with it the way I know how to deal with it. Doesn't make it right, but that is one of our operating realities. And you know what? It's not unique to Battle Creek. It's happening across the country. And we don't have to look far to see that it's happening to our neighbors all around us. Let's go to the next slide. Let's talk about cold cases for just a moment. First of all, there's nothing, I think, we all heard it the other day. When you have a parent or you have a mother up here and she's lost a child, a son especially, or a daughter, and there has been no justice because there's been no action, that can't tear at your heart, and you're inhuman if it doesn't. Bottom line up front, it drives all of us. It drives the focus of the investigations that we work on. And nothing is more frustrating for an investigative team when they can't get the evidence obligated by our criminal justice system to meet the threshold to put it in front of a prosecutor, to get a charge, and where a prosecutor can confidently put it in front of a jury. It's frustrating for everyone involved. And the fact that we have a couple out there, Michael and Bonnie Nunnally, have for many years, they have produced a list, and they have an organization called Families Against Murder and for Equal Justice Fame. We heard that list mentioned just the other day. And so what would like to do now is just clarify some of the discrepancies in numbers. And what I'm really basically going to say to you, we're pretty darn close. The reality of it is many of the cases that they have in their particular list, they count every single victim, which is significant in exactly what you would expect them to do. In law enforcement, we don't necessarily count each victim. We count each case. We monitor case because cases are incidents. Incidents come with evidence, and that is how we carry a case forward. But in some cases, as we look at the two lists, our list and this community-driven list that Fame produced, we notice that in some of the cases, at least 4, there are multiple victims. So we've got one case, one cold case, and they have multiple. So there's one accounting. Some of the cases that were counted weren't even in our jurisdiction. Don't make them less important, but certainly that is one reason why there's some discrepancies. And then finally, there were some cases that we don't necessarily consider cold yet. We still think that they are active and they are still moving forward. And in a few other cases, there are names on our list that weren't on the other lists. But really, when you look at the two lists, they are very, very close once you break away and strip away some of those numbers. So I can say confidently that the two lists really do work well together. Let's go on. One more thing. Since 1968, we've had 302 homicides. 225 have been cleared. That's a 75% clearance rate. The national average for homicide clearance rates at this time is 61%. So again, there is not a department out there, there is not a detective out there, there's not a prosecutor out there that has ever solved a homicide on their own. They were solved because there was community interest, there was community input, and they were driven by information compelled through the community. And that's how it happens. We can't do this on our own. Next slide is, we have had discussions with the prosecutor's office. We've talked about trying to get this information out. We have programs. Currently, we have cold case investigators. Both Calhoun County does. Battle Creek Police Department has several cases we're currently working. And then finally, Olivet College, we entered into a program jointly with the prosecutor's office to have Olivet College students review multiple cold cases. However, we're also working on the next phase of that project is having a joint website where all of this information can be put out. But what we would like to see is that is put through the prosecutor's office so that information is good. One, it's validated. Two, we make sure we have one source, which includes all of Calhoun County, and that's where it comes out of one particular agency versus multiple different agencies. That way we don't have to deal with these discrepancies. Next slide, please. Again, this is a situational brief right here now. It doesn't cover the entire city. It didn't cover all of the situations that we are dealing with on a daily basis. But really, the segue into these next few meetings, can I have a witness, is simply this. These meetings are designed for the community, the pastors, police officers, all of us together to work through and try to change our current situation. That's our operating reality. That's really where we want to go. Not one person has the right. Not one person has a voice. Not one person has a platform that should drive this conversation. No matter who it is, we all have a part in how we get the information out. Try to develop education on what does it mean to be a good witness. Develop what is the criminal justice system. By the way, the criminal justice system is not the victim advocacy system. And it's so misunderstood. It is designed to the benefit of the accused. And that is such a challenging and philosophical twist for our sense of justice as Americans, because in many cases we simply say what happens, well, that's not fair. Welcome to my world. Welcome to the criminal justice system. But I think talking about it, and that's what we are intending to do with these series of meetings. And I just want to thank the Commission for getting behind it, city staff for getting behind it, and again for Commissioner Lynn Ward Gray for pushing it. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Chief, for your thorough report. And Chris Simmons has the first question.
Next slide.
Chief, indeed, thank you. I think you addressed many of the questions and comments that a couple of weeks ago we heard from those families. And are they going to be happy with the answers? Maybe not. They're tough answers to tough questions that maybe don't have answers to them. But I think you did your best to try to answer as many of those as you could. One of the things that they had suggested was larger rewards for turning someone in. I didn't hear you touch on that. I don't know where that money comes from when we hear about there being a reward for a tip to lead for an arrest there. Can you address that?
I can. So we do have Silent Observer Funds. That is a program managed by the Chamber of Commerce. It's an underutilized program. But there are challenges with paying for information. There are challenges when it gets to the court, challenges when the defense attorney gets a hold of it and asks you, why are you here? And was it because of the issue, or was it because you were paid to be here? There are some issues with it, but we do have the program. We do utilize the program when it's necessary. But indeed, it's always been out there, but not that many people take advantage of it.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Any other questions? Yes, Commissioner Ferris.
Thank you. So for the last few years, we've had a real focus on community policing and building relationships so that we're able to build trust, because it's been a proven way to solve and prevent crime in our community. We've already established that this lack of trust leads to a lack of cooperation and communication, which then leads to a lack of evidence and a lack of an ability for you to prosecute. So I was concerned recently when a Battle Creek Inquirer article came out that gave the impression that we have a zero tolerance policy here in Battle Creek, and that people will be picked up for any minor crime. And the reason why this was concerning to me is that we already know that the witnesses and victims in these cases are often being intimidated, or they're fearful about street retaliation. And my fear was that this article in particular, and perhaps actions taken on behalf of the police department, might put the fear into people of being arrested if they were to come forth with information. And I still want to make sure that we're not doing anything that's going to prevent conversations and community building from happening. And so I did email the chief earlier about these concerns, and he was able to give me an answer via email. But I wanted to make sure that that answer goes out to the public, so that the people that are involved more directly with these incidents might be more likely to come forth.
That's right. I think it's a great question, too. So In that particular moment, I would say zero tolerance isn't a program, nor is it a strategy. If anything, it's an expression. And it's expression, if anything, a warning. And that is these particular, the threshold, the shootings and the violence and those involved, that's really what the officer or we are speaking to in general when a comment like that is made. Every single day we use our discretion, we work with members of the community. We seize the opportunity when we can work with somebody. Matter of fact, that is where some of the best work is done, at that community, officer, and person-to-person interaction. However, there is a limit to that level of discretion. And when we have folks, trigger pullers, folks that are out there shooting, and that we know who they are, we know how they're involved, we have less and less tolerance for them and their activities. And they know. And so when that expression is used, that is exactly who it is targeted to. And here's something even more important to understand, is that the expression doesn't suspend their rights as a citizen, doesn't suspend our ethics as a police department or our policies. Those all still will be followed. But at the same time, when we say zero tolerance, what we're really speaking to is this violent crime of these shooters. That is what we're referring to. Not that it was ever tolerated before, but I think it was just an outward expression to say, hey, we really want you to know. You have to stop, or we're going to look for you. We're going to find you, and if there's a violation, any type, we're going to try to take you in, book you, and if for any reason, we'll suspend whatever activity you had planned, whatever you were planning to do. We're going to try to suspend it. A large part of my presentation tonight talked about street justice, right? We talked about that idea to get revenge. Sometimes these arrests help abate that, and that's exactly what he was referring to.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other commission comments? Commissioner Sophia.
Thank you. A couple of things, Chief. So when you talked about sometimes victims being unwilling to cooperate, they don't want to acknowledge that anything happened, why does that matter? So I thought that, like using domestic violence for an example, so if my husband hits me, it doesn't matter if I decide after the fact that we've made up, I don't want to press charges. You were there, you know that it happened, it doesn't matter. So why, if someone shoots me and I decide I don't want to pursue that, why does that affect your ability to send the shooter to prison?
As I shared in that one example, and that's really what I was trying to highlight when I shared the actual sentencing, is that it matters based on the quality of the case that we can present to the jury.
Okay.
And it's also a much higher threshold that the prosecutor has to put in front of that jury and in front of the judge, knowing that the accused doesn't have to say anything. So really all you have is what you think you know, not first person, not corroborated, or based on what the victim, first person, is willing to tell you.
Okay.
And so because of that, you may end up getting a charge, but you're not going to get the charge you really wanted.
Okay.
Which again would have been 3 to 5 years, 7 to 10 years based on their record. Maybe we'll get 6 months. And again, let's also, when you think about 6 months, time served, so they've been there for 3 months, they've been there for 4 months, now they finally had their trial, time served, they'll be out almost immediately after the trial itself, and guess who's going to remember who testified against them?
Yeah.
It's much shorter memory once you start to think of it in that terms.
Okay.
And so again, the witness is taking all the risk at this moment. So what I was trying to share with you is there's a broad spectrum of challenges. It's not just uncooperative witnesses. It's not just uncooperative victims. It's a host of reasons and a host of variables that we have to deal with.
Okay. And then one other question. So when you were talking about incidents and how you categorize, so there might be 3 individuals involved, but 1 incident. So if you've got, sort of that retaliatory street justice kind of thing going on, does that all come under the umbrella of 1 incident, which would be the instigating incident, and then any successive shootings or contacts with law enforcement, do they fall under that umbrella, or are they all separate?
So every incident is an incident in and of itself. right? So multiple different shootings, we treat them as multiple different shootings. What I was referring to is if we have a shooting, let's say a homicide, where there's multiple victims, it's still one case.
Okay.
We just have multiple victims associated with that one case.
Okay. Thank
So
you.
there is a slight difference.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Commissioner. And Commissioner, Student Advisory Council, Ms. Potter? would you
Okay.
like-
I had another question in regards to the rewards money. I know a homicide that happened late March, the family had to come together and try to fundraise rewards money for people to speak up. And I feel like the community and also the police department should take situations like that more seriously, because it is sick that in order for victims to speak up, that they want money, that you have to offer money, but it's just something that you should really recognize that some people are money hungry. And so that if you do put forth like a big amount of prize money for people coming forth and speaking on situations, I feel like a lot of more witnesses will come forth and speak on situations. So I feel like that could help a lot with unsolved murders or crimes as such.
And I think that's really a great observation that you made, and I'm really glad you mentioned it. So the data to date hasn't necessarily suggested that kind, paying for information, is as good, or do we get the results that we necessarily want in a courtroom. However, there are programs out there, like Silent Observer, that will pay for information if we get a conviction. So there's a caveat there. There are multiple times in many cases, even locally and of course nationally, where families have tried to elicit their friends and family and neighbors by doing some fundraising. And there's certainly, you can do that. But again, that is something that will more than likely be brought up in a trial and has to be addressed. Can it be? Yes. It's just one more variable, one more threshold that you have to convince a jury that did not have an impact on the quality of what you saw as a person. And again, this is our system. It's a system driven by us, our peers. And you can at least understand some of the challenges with it. But that's a great point. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Potter. Are there any other Commissioner Ferris? Flores, excuse me.
It's all right. First, thank you, Ms. Potter. It's great to hear your voice and your participation in this conversation. I'm glad you're here. Chief, thank you. Thank you for all the information. I hear loud and clear your points of, there are a lot of challenges and complications, and this is, deep community, rooted issues, and, the police department can't do this alone. I do have a couple, specific, follow-ups from the commission meeting where we had folks here. What follow-up was done with those folks specifically and around some of their specific asks? I'll ask that and then I'll go to my next one.
So many of the questions that brought up as we tried to kind of delve through what were questions and statements, of course, were put in this particular presentation. You'll notice we did discuss a little bit about cold cases. We discussed what we would like to do with cold cases and the data. All that information or that work is being done right now. Matter of fact, it gave us an opportunity to deep dive into the differences between these lists and sparse some of that out. So now the question is, how are we going to share it and disseminate that information? And more importantly, who's going to validate it? But again, as I suggested when we started this meeting, we are in our high op-tempo operational period, and we do hope that there will be a pause as we move into the fall and the winter, where we'll have a little more time and the staff capability to do more. Mm-hmm. But those discussions are ongoing.
Are those folks involved in some of these plans? I'm just curious, there was a specific group, an organized group that came, and I'm, just curious about the specific. I understand, you've done a lot of work in this and in gathering the data to be able to respond in that way. Just wanting to make sure that we're closing the loop on some of the folks that brought their concerns to us in the first place.
Right. So when we start these town hall forums, one will be Thursday at 6, mm-hmm. and then the other one will be at 1 on Friday. And then we have one more planned on the 31st at 9 in the morning. The information's on the board. And there is where we hope to determine. We want this to be
Okay.
community-driven. We certainly do have our ideas about what we would like to do, whether gang violence initiative program or some other things, but and what we want to share. But again, we just had a conversation today is, okay, and when we end these meetings, what's the takeaway? What's the product? What can we do? And that I'd like, instead of doing it here, I'd like to see what Thursday, Friday, and then the following week will bring us.
Okay, great. That was actually related to my follow-up, which if you could give us a little, preview, like what are people, like what's going to happen at those meetings? What should people expect? Why should they come? Again, I'm fully supportive. I think it's a great way, and also appreciate you and especially, also Commissioner Gray for, organizing these. But can you give us a little bit more of a preview?
I can, and I tell you, this has been a lot of work. Staff, the department, Commissioner Gray, and others have put into this effort. And a lot of community conversations. And yes, well, we have an agenda. You always start out with an agenda, and then the meeting is what the meeting is. But what we hope to do is, one, give a lot of opportunity and voice to folks that are a part of this, that have been in this work, former felons or folks that were former gang members, both local and from the Detroit area. We want to listen to them. What has worked? How has it worked? And what can we learn from the work that you're doing? There's also an educational component, a little bit into what is the criminal justice system, and to address some of those challenges and myths that I sort of alluded to today. And then, what does it mean? Can I get a witness? What does it mean to be a good witness? And what are the challenges associated with that? Some questions are, can I be a witness anonymously? Can I testify so that no one knows who I am? And their answer is yes, but it depends. The threshold, again, is very high and oftentimes depends on the case, the jurisdiction, and the judge. And so there are a lot of nuances to this discussion, and again, we're going to seize this opportunity and have those discussions.
Great. I unfortunately I'm going to be traveling, and so I won't be able to be at any of these, unfortunately. I'm hoping there will be, a loop back, with us of, how these things went and what that means, as we move forward.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Chief.